All right, it is past time to get started for class. I'd planned to do something different today in the class, but changed my mind. Larry and I talked about this, and we thought in light of the fact that Jonathan Medley's name has been put forward to the congregation be an elder, we ought to talk about the qualifications of elders. It's been 2 years now since we installed elders, and that was myself and Larry. And installing an elder in a congregation is a very serious thing. And so in light of that, we thought we need to review the qualifications. I think sometimes churches get slack about that. And it is a lot easier to install a man into the office than it is to remove a man from the office. And so a congregation needs to think very seriously, and we need to review the qualifications. Now, the qualifications of elders are listed in 2 places in the Bible, 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1. And so I want to cover these in this class today, so we're going to have to, if you want to make comments or ask questions, you can, but it would be good if we can go through all these qualifications in this one class period, because next Sunday the intention is to install Jonathan if there aren't any objections, and so far there haven't been any, and that speaks well of him. First thing I want to say before we go over these is, number one, you can't add to the qualifications that God has given. The reason I say that is sometimes people get to thinking, well, he's not 60 years old, you know, an elder needs to be at least a certain age. Well, you can't say that. The Lord didn't make up that qualification, and so we can't add qualifications. Sometimes I've heard people say, my name was put forward one time, and somebody said, well, he can't be an elder, he's a preacher. Well, that's a made-up qualification. That's something that people have. You can't make up qualifications that are not in the Bible. Secondly, you can't take away qualifications. Sometimes somebody might say, well, you know, he meets most of the qualifications. He's got all of them but one, and we think if we install him, he'll grow in that area. Well, it doesn't work that way either. You can't add to qualifications. You can't take away qualifications. He has to have all of the qualifications laid out in the Bible. And you can't substitute qualifications. You can't say, well, this guy is a really good businessman, he should be an elder. Or this guy, he works in the government, and he's got a position where he's respected, and so he'd be a good elder. Not necessarily. Doesn't mean that. You can't say, well, this guy's popular. Everybody likes him. He's got a good sense of humor, and so he would be a good elder. If he doesn't meet the qualifications, he will not be a good elder. And so you can't add to the qualifications. You can't take away. You can't substitute. I've got a lot more on that, but for the sake of time, we're not going to go through all of this. Now, let's see here. You probably can't see that, can you? Can y'all read that? Okay, I put this QR code up here, and this is a sheet that I put together that has the qualifications of elders. In fact, here are 2 QR codes. If you want to download it for yourself, you can take a picture of this on your phone and click on it, and it will take you to that link, and you can download the PDF, and that way you can have the material that is on there. What I did was I made 2 rows. One lists the qualifications from 1 Timothy chapter 3. The other lists the qualifications from Titus chapter 1. It puts them side by side, and then there is a summary. When I see everyone through taking pictures, I'll go back to it. But that is something you can have it yourself, because we want you to be thoughtful and prayerful and to go through these things. All right, and like I said, the PowerPoint is there if you want to go through all of these things. Now, here is, can you see? I know you can't see that because that's going to be too high. I can't even see that, and I'm right here. But this, if you print it out, this is a detailed list of the qualifications. It breaks it down, it explains it. And here is the sheet. You've got 1 Timothy chapter 3, and then Titus chapter 1, and then a brief explanation. Basically, the 2 are the same. There's a little bit of difference between the 2. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to go through these, and we're just going to kind of summarize them. 1 Timothy chapter 3, we're going to use as the guideline, verses 1 through 7. So I'm going to read it. In fact, I'm not even going to read it for the sake of time because we're going to go through each of the points. But the first thing I want to say is this. In 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 1, he begins with these words, "If a man desires the office of an elder, he desires a good work." I've oftentimes heard people say the first qualification, what was that? The first qualification of an elder, I hear people say, is that he must desire the work. I don't believe that's a qualification of an elder. I believe rather than a qualification, this is a clarification. In other words, what he is saying is this: if a man desires this office, that's a good thing. Why would he say that before he starts to give the qualifications? Because I think sometimes people might see a person who says, well, I desire to be an elder, and folks might say, well, he wants to be in charge. He's hungry for power. This guy, he just wants to control things. And he's saying, don't think of it that way. If a man desires the office of an elder, that's a good thing. That's a good work. Think of it properly. And so he says, if a man desires the office of an elder, he desires a good work. And then he says, a bishop must then be. So he says, if he desires this, that's good. And then he says, all right, with that behind us, a bishop must then have these qualifications. So he states it even before he gives the qualifications. Now, with that said, if a man does not want to be an elder, he probably should not be an elder. The reason I make this distinction is because sometimes I've seen people say, well, you know, I think I meet the qualifications, but I just really don't want to do it because it's hard. There's a lot of difficult things that come with being an elder, and that is true. It is heartbreaking. It tugs at your heart. There's always something going on that people don't know about. It takes a lot of hours, and there's a lot of things about being an elder that I don't like doing. And Larry would tell you the same thing. And someone might say, well, I don't desire to get involved in all of those heartbreaking things, and so I'm not qualified. I don't think that's the point at all. You know, when Jesus went to the cross, did he desire that? He didn't desire it. As a matter of fact, what he said was, Lord, if there's any other way, let this cup pass from me. He did not desire it, but he did it because he loved the will of the Father and he loved the Father. And so a person maybe says, I love the church, and so because of that, I'm going to deal with these things even though I don't want to. So just because a man doesn't desire those things does not mean that he's not qualified to serve as an elder. That's the whole point that I'm making. All right, let's jump into the qualifications. And again, I know you probably can't see that, but this is the list. That's why I made it where you could download it if you wanted it. But number one, an elder must be blameless. Another translation says above reproach. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that he's going to be sinless. 1 John chapter 1 and verse 8 says, if we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. Nobody is sinless. Nobody is perfect. And if we expect a man to be perfect before he's qualified to be an elder, we're making a mistake. And if we expect him to be perfect after he becomes an elder, we are also making a mistake. So what does the Bible mean when it says an elder must be blameless? The Greek word here literally means, according to Vines, nothing that can be laid hold of. What does that mean? Linsky says it means he's of such a character that no one can rightfully lay a charge of unfitness against him. In other words, there's nothing that something can point to and say, yeah, you know, he did this, or he's guilty of this, or when people think of him, they think of this. He's not like that. David Lipscomb said that this verse means that elders are men whose character is unimpeachable. They stand in high esteem in the public for their pure life and their integrity. And that's what we're talking about. They are blameless. Any questions about that? Okay, he's got a good reputation. So if he's known for dishonesty, would he be qualified? Would he be blameless? What if he's got a what if people, when they think about him, he uses foul language, or he's got just foul humor, tells dirty jokes? Would he be blameless? No, he's not going to be. What if he's a womanizer? You know, he makes sexual comments. What if he forsakes the assembly to go to ball games? He would be blameless. See, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. All right, let's go to the second one. Husband of one wife. Now, that short phrase tells us a lot about this guy. Number one, it means only men can be elders, because only men can be husbands, right? I used to say that, and people say, well, yeah. Now people say, well, that's not true. A woman can be a husband. But in the Greek, this is a masculine word that only refers to a male. Only a male can fill this role. So, number one, it must be a man to be an elder. Number two, he must be a married man. He has to be the husband of one wife. Notice it doesn't say if he's married, it says he's married. He must be a man. He must be a married man. Sometimes I've been in congregations and we would ask for candidates. We would ask for people to turn in the names for elders, and people would inevitably turn in the name of a single man. If he's not married, he's not a candidate to be an elder. So he must be a man, he must be a married man, and he must be married to one woman. He can't be a polygamist. He can't be in an unscriptural marriage. Now, Paul is not teaching that if he's married, he is saying he is married. Now, I can say a lot about that, but for the sake of time, I'm not going to get into that. Now, somebody might say, why has he got to be married? I don't understand that. Why does an elder have to be married? The Lord doesn't really tell us the reasons. You know, we could speculate. Verse number 4 says he has to have children, so he needs to be married for that reason. Verse 2 says he must be given to hospitality. Can a single man be given to hospitality? Yeah, but wouldn't it be easier if you are a married man? There's a lot of weight on an elder. Having a companion helps with that. Sometimes he might have to deal with a woman, and it helps with if he's married. Now, sometimes people will ask if a divorced man can be an elder. If he's been divorced and he's been remarried, scripturally, can he be an elder? Yes. If he's the innocent party and he put away his spouse for fornication and he's remarried in the sight of God, yes, he can be an elder. I think the same thing is true if a man lost his wife to death and he is remarried. Then he's the husband of one wife. I've heard people say, no, he's the husband of two wives. If he's the husband of two wives, then he's an adulterer. He's a polygamist. He is the husband of one wife. The fact is, when he died, he's no longer the husband of that woman anymore, because Romans 7:1-4 says death separated that. I've never understood how people get confused about that. Death ends that, and so same with the divorce. If he's divorced, that ends that, and he moves on. Any questions about that one? Okay. Well, as an elder, you're going to have to deal with a lot of things along those lines. And if you haven't been married, there'd be a lot of things you don't know. You haven't experienced. All right? Hold that thought. Here's the next one. He must be vigilant. The King James says temperate. The ESV, I think, is the best on this. It says self-controlled. The Greek, literally, here is kind of confusing to us, but literally, it's metaphoric. But literally, it says holding no wine. And the metaphor is, if a person is drinking wine, how does he behave? You know, he kind of goes off, and he doesn't have a good temperament. And this is a metaphor that is saying he doesn't behave like a person who's been drinking wine. And so he's got a proper temperament. He is self-controlled. He's vigilant. He's sober-minded, serious about serious things. He's serious about himself. He's serious about spiritual matters. He's serious about the welfare of the church. Again, the ESV says self-controlled. And so vigilance, probably not a bad translation. All right, here's the next one. Sober. Now, sober The New King James says sober-minded. I'm hearing feedback. Am I in a bad position here? Should I move or nothing I can do about it? Okay. I think sometimes Hunter was saying the positioning to the speakers maybe gives me an issue, but I kind of like to be right here in the middle of everybody. That's where I like to be. But sober, this word actually comes from two Greek words. One is the word for save, and the other is the word for mind. Put that together. You save your mind. What does that mean? A person who hasn't lost his mind is literally what it means. Thayer's lexicon says of sound mind. He's got good senses, curbing one's desires and impulses. In 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 7, there's a noun form of this word that means sound mind. And so an elder's got a good sound mind. He's got good judgment. He's not impulsive. He's not gullible. He's not unreasonable, excitable, passionate. He's reasonable. He's restrained. He's sound in his thinking. He doesn't let his emotions control him so that he loses his objectivity. Let me ask you this. Could a person lose this qualification about having a sound mind just because of age? Yeah. A man could get to the point that age makes him kind of lose his mind. And if that happens, he needs to step down. He might not even know it. And so the other elder or the other elders need to tell him he can't serve as an elder anymore. Maybe a man has a stroke, and as a result of that, his mind's not the same anymore. He shouldn't serve as an elder because he doesn't meet this qualification. That's a hard thing if a man's been an elder for a long time, and then you've got to tell him he can't serve as an elder anymore. You say, well, that's dishonoring him. Yeah, but he doesn't meet this qualification. You can see why this would be important. I want to say so much about every one of these, but there's 13. So, of good behavior. This is an interesting word to me. It's kosmios. This is a word that literally means orderly. It's interesting to me when I look this up. This is the same word in 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 9 that says women should dress themselves in modest apparel. It's the word modest. It carries with it the idea of orderly or decent. In our modern language, probably the way we would say this word is, he's a gentleman. He behaves himself orderly, appropriately. He's not rude and crude. He's not rebellious. You know, some people just kind of have a rebellious nature about them. You'll bring something up to them. I wouldn't take that. I'd put him in his place. Boy, I'd pull a gun on that guy. You know, some people just have that nature. That's not this guy. Pulpit commentary says, an elder must have a love for good rules. Brother Bobby Duncan wrote, the one who is of good behavior is one who conducts himself in an orderly and well-mannered fashion in connection with the affairs of the church. I'm about to run Sister Joyce over here. By the way, she turned 85 today. It's her birthday. So while I'm right here, what's that?
You're a main man.
She's rebuking an elder right here in front of everybody. So, but I'm right here in her face. I can call her out. It's her birthday. 85, that's a great accomplishment. Yeah. And she said Social Security marks her birthday tomorrow, right? So she'll be 86 tomorrow. How about that? So she celebrates it on the 30th. Social Security's got it wrong. They do it on the next day. So anyway, so I called you out. I need to move on, she said. All right. I'm not blameless. I don't have good behavior. I've failed in several of these. So, all right, here is the next one. The next one is given to hospitality. Titus chapter 1 and verse 8 says he must be a lover of hospitality. This is an interesting word because it comes from two Greek words. One is a word that means friendly, and the other is a word that means strangers. He's friendly to strangers. The word hospitality carries with it the idea that he reaches out to people. He talks to people. He is friendly to people that he doesn't know. Why would that be important to a man who's an elder? He's going to bring people in, and not just strangers, but an elder is going to be a guy who takes people out to eat. takes people into his home. He does things like that. He's not just the guy that you see at worship services, and that's all. If that's it, he's not qualified to be an elder. It's easy to see why God would say if a man's going to be an elder, he's got to be hospitable. Here's the next one. Apt to teach. I'm going to add to that he's got to be able to teach well enough to stop the mouths of false teachers. And I'll tell you why I'm going to add that in a minute. Some translations say able to teach. And so sometimes when a church is considering a man to be an elder, they'll say, well, he's able to teach, but we've never seen him teach, but he is able. And so sometimes a man won't teach. I was in a congregation one time. We had an elder, hadn't taught in like 20 years. And it was brought up, well, he's not apt to teach. And they said, well, he's able. And that's what that word means, is he's able. How do you know he's able if you never see him do it? It would be like me saying, boy, my son-in-law, he is able to do some good woodwork. And you say, oh, really? What's he done? Well, I've never seen him do anything. What would you say? How do you know he's able? In fact, it carries with it the idea, Thayer's Greek lexicon says it means that he's skilled at teaching. How do you know he's skilled at teaching if he doesn't teach? The man teaches. If somebody says what just means he's able to do it, don't you believe that. It means he does it, and he's good at it. If he doesn't, he's not qualified to be an elder. I get so sick of hearing people, well, he doesn't ever teach, but he's qualified to be an elder. No, he's not. In Titus's account, I think it helps us. Titus chapter 1 and verse 9 says, he may be able to give instruction in sound doctrine and also to rebuke those who contradict it. And so, Titus chapter 1 and verse 10 says this. It gives the qualifications of an elder, verses 1 through 9, and then in verse 10 it says this, for, in other words, here's the reason, there are many insubordinate. We don't use that word a whole lot, but insubordinate. Think about somebody who's insubordinate. There are many insubordinate and empty talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, the Jews who were stirring up trouble. They must be silenced, since they are upsetting whole families by teaching things for shameful gain, which they ought not. What does that mean? An elder must be skillful. Why? Because there are a lot of insubordinate, empty talkers and deceivers in the church, and he says, and they must be silenced. An elder's got to be good enough in his teaching that he can silence these people. So not only does he have to be good at teaching, I'm telling you there's kind of an extra qualification built in there, and that is he's got to have some backbone, right? Can you silence the mouths of false teachers if you don't have backbone? You can't do it. You can't be a pushover. This doesn't mean you're a bully, doesn't mean you steamroll people, but it means you've got the backbone to stand up and the skill and the knowledge to say, that's not right. If you can't do that, you're not elder material.
Often that can happen in churches sometimes, and if it's viewed from the pulpit, I've seen them go forward and kind of rebuke somebody for doing that.
Sure. If we had a guest speaker here and they got up and taught error, I promise they would be stopped before the lesson was over, or if it was subtle, it would get addressed before they leave. Why? Because I know our eldership. We're going to deal with that. We're not going to let that go on. Jonathan? Okay, I like that. Yeah, that's right. That's a good way to say it. Glenn's good at that. His book on Awake at Night is about elders. And the title tells you a lot. Glenn served as an elder for 10 years at West Huntsville. One time at North Charleston, somebody got up and they were teaching premillennialism. And they didn't know. They thought it was right. And I didn't mean to embarrass him. I was one of the elders at North Charleston. And I felt like I was probably most qualified to deal with it. And so I went to the back and I caught the elders privately and I said, what are we going to do about this? would you like me to address it? And they said yes. And I went to the front as soon as he got done, and I said, brethren, I don't think this brother knew it, but what he said was not right. And we dealt with it right then and there. Why? Because I wanted that group who heard it to hear it corrected right then and there. Very awkward when you have to do that sort of thing, but we tried to be kind with him about it. Frank?
Also, an incident that I run into was in a Bible class. You know about Jesus turning water into wine.
I've heard about that.
Yeah, teacher said that, well, he may have taken a little nip, so he
Wow.
didn't even understand that part of it.
Yeah.
He was straightened out at that moment right away.
Right. And
He
you
just didn't understand it.
And you can be kind about it. That's the thing. There might be times you got to be stern, depending on when he talks about those in Titus 1 and verse 10, whose mouths must be stopped. I think that's going to be stern, dealing with somebody like this. Probably going to depend on the nature of the person and whether it's ignorance or false teachers. And did I see another hand? Okay, let's go to the next one here. Got a lot. Next, not given to wine. The ESV says not a drunkard. Of course, this is talking about alcoholic wine. Wine in the Bible can be alcoholic, it can be non-alcoholic. The idea is if a man drinks alcoholic beverages, he can't be an elder. Could you imagine a man being an example to the flock? And how could he be sober-minded if he drinks alcohol? He can't, if he drinks alcohol, he cannot serve as an elder. All right, next. Am I on the right one there? I can't even read it. Not given to wine. There we go. The next one says, the King James says, not a striker, not a brawler. I remember reading in the, what did they call it, the Gen Z Bible, which is not a good Bible, but it has some interesting phrases. Not a striker, not a brawler. It says something to the effect, not quick to throw down. That was kind of a good description there. He's not quick to have a fight. The New King James says he's not violent, but gentle. He's not quarrelsome. And so, the Titus chapter 1 says he's not soon angry. It means he doesn't have a temper. Thayer says he's not a bruiser. He's not ready with the blow. He says he's not pugnacious, contentious, quarrelsome person. The word not a brawler literally means abstaining from a fight. And so he's not a guy that loses his temper. He flies off the handle. He doesn't have a short fuse. He's not ornery. You get it. This is not a hard one to understand. If a man's got a short fuse, he's not qualified to be. No, he controls himself. Of course, this applies to every Christian, right? Not just in fact, most of these apply to every Christian. Not every Christian has to be married and has to have children, but most of these qualifications apply to everybody. James chapter 1 and verse 9, wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. You listen, you control yourself, you're slow to speak. Proverbs 14 and verse 17, he that is soon angry deals foolishly. Verse 29, he that is slow to wrath is of great understanding. Proverbs 15:18 says that one who is slow to anger appeases strife. And think about that when you're teaching your children. What if you're a person who flies off the handle? What does that teach your children? You know, we live in the age of rage. People flying off the handle. I see these kind of videos all the time on Facebook or YouTube where people jump out their car and start punching the window. You ever see these? They start punching the windows. That guy's not qualified to be an elder. In fact, that guy needs to be arrested. But that sort of thing goes on all the time. Here's the next one. Not covetous or greedy of filthy lucre. What does that mean? What's that? He loves money. The New King James says he's not greedy for money. It means he doesn't have an unhealthy desire for possessions or money. Doesn't mean that he's not wealthy. An elder could be wealthy. Doesn't mean he doesn't have a lot. Doesn't even mean that he works and has a business and desires to make money. Literally, it means he's not fond of silver. That's okay. He's not all about, he doesn't love money. That's the point. It's not first in his list of priorities.
One thing about that too also, is your priorities and your time spent in that
Yep, that's true. If he loves money, it's going to dominate him. So that's a good point. Here's the next one.
I think, quick comment on that, I think that can lend itself to not having field games too. In other words, there's ways to make money and ways to not make money, and you can sure hurt people by making it the wrong way.
Man,
There's a lot to be said about that, but I'll leave it at that.
that is so very true. If you love money, you get to the point that you might strong-arm people. You might twist things, spin things. The love of money brings a lot of bad things with it. All right, next. Patient. The New King James says gentle. This Greek word appears 5 times in the New Testament. Only here is it translated as patient. It's translated as gentle in Titus 3, James 3, 1 Peter chapter 2. Philippians 4 and verse 5, it's translated as moderation. Kittle's Theological Dictionary says, the reasonable man who stays within the limits of what is moderate and orderly. Thayer says seemly, suitable, equitable, fair, mild, gentle. It's not an outrageous man. He's a self-controlled. You see how many of these relate to his character? He's reasonable. He's got good judgment. He controls himself. He doesn't fly off the handle. Before a man's prepared to lead God's people, he first has to have control of himself. That's the point we're making. Next, he rules his own house well. Verse 4 says, one that rules his own house well, having his children in subjection with all gravity. If a man doesn't know how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? Now, there is a related statement in Titus chapter 1 and verse 6 that says an elder must have faithful children, not accused of riot or unruly. I want to read you another version, or another verse from another version. A man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild or disobedient. Brethren, there is more controversy over this qualification than any other in these 2 chapters. So let me hit them very quickly. We have till 11, right? Got 10 more minutes. All right. I know I'm flying through these, but it's a lot to cover. First, do these verses teach that an elder must have children, or are they designed to tell us that if he has children, what kind of children they must be? First, the indication is he must have children. Verse 5 discusses the ruling of his house and the ruling of his children as a gauge to whether or not he can rule the house of God. And so if he doesn't have children, that gauge is gone. You don't have it. In addition to that, though it isn't stated in the text, a man who has children can understand and he can sympathize with certain difficulties about rearing children. Monty was talking about a man that's married and he's experienced some of these things. If a man doesn't have that, he doesn't have. Can you imagine a man who's an elder who's going to guide a congregation full of people? You know, we just had a sermon about rearing children. One of the most difficult things you will ever do and encounter in the church is rearing your children. And it doesn't go. We've got 3 children that are grown and 3 grandchildren, and they probably ache our hearts more now. You worry about them and you look at the difficulties that are going on in their lives. Being a parent is a hard, hard thing to do. Brother Bobby Duncan said this: we all know that those with the most experience in rearing children are those who don't have any children of their own. It is easy to criticize others and say what one's children would do when you don't have any children. And so that makes a good point about rearing children.
They will always be our children, even when they get older. And the way this word is quoted here, rules his own house, it's just like was said in old time, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So if one gets out, that we had to say, you know, that still you could be an elder, I believe.
Yep. Joshua 24:15, that's one of my favorite verses. All right, secondly, must he have a plurality of children, or is one enough? I've seen people argue about this, and it will say, the word here is children. That is a plural word, and so I see some people nodding their head. Y'all have heard this too, and they will say, so he's got to have at least 2 children. The word children here is used generically. If I were to ask the question, would everyone in here who has children please raise your hand? If you had one child, would you raise your hand? You would raise your hand. Are you raising your hand, or you got a comment?
No, I was raised my hand.
Okay.
That's what it says on your tax return.
Okay, that's right. That's right, and that's right. Even the government uses the term generically, right? And you might say, well, but the Bible says children. The Bible uses the word generically also. I'll give you numerous examples. Matthew 22 and verse 24, talking about the Old Testament levirate law of marriage. Moses said, if a man die having no children, his brother shall marry his wife and shall raise up seed unto his brother. The word children in that verse is plural, but it actually means if he doesn't have at least one child. That's what it means. Genesis 21 and verse 7, Sarah said, who would have said unto Abraham that Sarah should have breastfed, the way the King James says it, who would have breastfed children? But she was saying, I'm breastfeeding a child. But she uses the term children. I only had one child at the time, but she uses the word children. Matthew 19:29, and everyone who has forsaken houses or brethren or sister or father or mother or wife or children or lands for my name's sake shall receive 100-fold and inherit everlasting life. When Jesus says you've forsaken children, he doesn't mean, well, if you only had one child, that doesn't count. He's talking about in the generic sense. The Bible does that a lot. The Bible uses the term generically. Now, somebody might argue, yeah, but, if a man only has one child, he doesn't have as much experience as somebody who has two children. I guess that's true, but a man that only has two doesn't have as much experience as one that has three and four. You could make that argument, but that's not the qualification. The qualification is a man must have at least one child. So, thirdly, must an elder's children be faithful Christians, or does it just mean that they're faithful to their father? I don't see any reason to think it means anything other than faithful to Christ. And I think there would be some difficulty in judging an elder's children to be faithful to him if they're not faithful to Christ. Titus chapter 1 and verse 6, the American Standard says, an elder must be one having children that believe. It carries, the root there is pistuo, is from which we get the word faith. And so I believe he's teaching that a man must have at least one child, and that child must be a Christian, or that man's not qualified to serve as an elder. Well, then people want to ask, well, what if a man has 4 children and 3 are faithful and 1 is not? Does that disqualify the man? What if he's got 10 children, he's got 8 faithful and 2 are not? What if he's got 5 children and 5? We could get into all these kind of hypotheticals, but one man said it this way, and I thought it was a good statement. His rate of success should surely be greater than his rate of failure. I don't believe the text is saying that all of his children must be faithful. If he's got 10, 9 are faithful and 1's not, he's disqualified. I don't think that's the point that he's making, but this man has shown some success when it comes to raising children. If he's got 10, 1 faithful, and 9 are not, I'd have serious questions about installing that man as an elder. Another question that arises is, what if a man's children were faithful while they were in the house, but now they're out of the house and they're not faithful anymore? I have heard a lot of disagreement about this one. I know some brethren that I respect greatly who disagree with me about this point. They will say, well, this has to do with him ruling his own house. But the statement says if he doesn't know how to rule his own house, how can he rule the house of God? Brother Dave Miller said it this way, if a ship is in dry dock, it's hard to tell much about the ship. You can't tell much about the ship until you set it out to sail. Then you know how good a job the man did building the ship. I thought that's a pretty good statement. And it says he has faithful children. Present tense, he has faithful children. If his children leave his house and none of them are faithful, I don't think the man can say, I have faithful children. And so I'm of the persuasion, and I can give you a lot more information on this if you want to see it, but I believe he's got to have faithful children even after they have left the house. Titus chapter 1 and verse 6 in the ESV says, and his children are believers. Titus 1 and verse 6 in the New King James says, having faithful children. This is written in the present tense. It reveals continuous action. Literally, it says, presently having faithful children. We've often noticed from 1 John chapter 1 and verse 7 that the blood of Jesus Christ, if a man walks in the light, the blood of Jesus Christ is continually cleansing him. Present, active, subjunctive. This is in the present tense. Literally, he is continuing to have faithful children. People say, no, that's why it's in the house. It's not what it says. So people can argue with it, but that is not what it says. The debate is over household, but let's go on for the sake of time. We've got 2 minutes. Next, not a novice. This word literally means not newly planted. He's not newly planted. What does that mean? There's a note in the margin of the King James Bible that says, one newly come to the faith. The idea is he's not a new Christian. If a man just obeyed the gospel, he can't be an elder. And somebody says, well, he's only been a Christian a year, but boy, he's grown a lot in a year. He can't be a new Christian. An older preacher put it this way, the only way for one to not be a novice is to have spent years in service as a faithful Christian. There are no shortcuts. I like that. Here's the next one, having good report. 1 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 1 says this, moreover, he must have a good report of them that are without. What does that mean? Yeah, not just in the church, but outside of the church. Why would he have to have a good report from people outside of the church? Yeah, what if people in the church say he's a good guy, but the people he works with say, man, that guy he's foul. We don't trust him. He's dishonest. He doesn't treat his people right. He's not qualified to be an elder. How could that possibly work if he's got that kind of a reputation? This is very interesting because sometimes the members of the church don't know you as well as the people who work with you every day, right? All right, man, I want to say more about this, but here's the last one. He can't be self-willed. The word translated as self-willed refers to one who is dominated by self-interest. He's inconsiderate of others. He arrogantly asserts his own will. He's a controlling man. Sometimes I've seen men like that in eldership, and they bully the other elders. He shouldn't be an elder. And those other elders ought to have enough backbone to tell him, you're not going to do this, or you're not going to be an elder anymore. And they ought to have enough back. But sometimes a man like that he's a Diotrephes. There's one of those in the Bible. A man like that cannot be an elder. If a man doesn't have all of these characteristics, he cannot serve as an elder. Now, I know we went through these very quickly. If you have any questions, come and talk to me or Larry, and we'll be glad to go through these. Think about them, pray about them, and within the next week, let us know if you have any concerns. Otherwise, next week we're going to install an additional elder. Thank you very much.